The wind didn't just blow that night, it cut. Like shards of glass dragged across skin, sharp and relentless. He pulled the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders, but it barely helped. The bus shelter offered little more than a roof and 3 walls, none of them solid enough to block the cold that seeped up from the pavement and wrapped itself around his bones. He sat with his back pressed against the metal bench, knees drawn to his chest, trying to hold on to whatever warmth his body could still make. His breath came out in small, visible puffs, vanishing almost instantly into the dark. He hadn't planned for any of this. Not really. When his grandmother got sick, he'd stayed up late doing homework by her bedside, thinking she'd bounce back like she always did. She was tough, raised him alone since he was 6 after his parents were gone in a crash no one liked to talk about. She worked double shifts at the diner, saved every spare coin, and never once let him feel like he was missing anything. But this time the cough didn't go away. The color didn't return to her cheeks. And one quiet Tuesday morning, she just didn't wake up. At first, there were arrangements, flowers, a small service, neighbors bringing casseroles. But then came the silence. Relatives showed up, not out of concern, but to sort through her things. One cousin said his apartment was too small. Another mentioned his wife was expecting and they couldn't take on extra stress. No one looked him in the eye for long. By the end of the week, the house was empty except for him and a duffel bag stuffed with clothes, a photo album, and the birth certificate she'd kept in her jewelry box just in case. He tried staying at a friend's place for a few nights, sleeping on a couch that smelled like old pizza and laundry detergent. But teenagers aren't known for their patience, and soon his friend's mom started giving him tight-lipped looks every time he walked in. He didn't blame her. He'd be a burden. So he left before they had to ask. The first night outside, he told himself it was temporary, just until he figured something out. But days turned into weeks, and figuring something out felt more like sinking deeper into quicksand. He learned fast how to move without being seen, how to slip into the public library just before closing to warm up, how to fill a water bottle at a gas station sink without drawing attention, how to time his walks so he never lingered too long in one spot. Hunger became a constant hum in his stomach, low and nagging, sometimes sharp when it got really bad. He'd stare at grocery store windows, not with longing, but with a strange kind of calculation. How much bread could he buy with the few coins he'd found in a parking lot? Was it worth the risk of someone noticing him counting change too slowly? He avoided shelters, not because he thought he was above them, but because the story scared him. Overcrowded rooms, fights breaking out over bunks, the way some people looked at you like you were already lost. He wasn't lost. He just didn't have a place to be. Sleep was the hardest part. Every night he picked a new spot. A loading dock behind a closed bakery, a bench near the train tracks, once even under a bridge where the wind howled like a wounded animal. But the bus shelter became his reluctant favorite. It was near a 24-hour laundromat, so there was always a little light, and sometimes the hum of dryers gave the illusion of company. He'd curl up as small as he could, tucking his hands under his armpits, trying to ignore the ache in his feet from walking all day in shoes that were starting to split at the sole. One evening, as sleet began to fall, mixing with the cold rain, he pressed himself deeper into the corner of the shelter. His fingers were numb. He tried rubbing them together, but it barely helped. That's when he noticed the old man walking toward him from down the street, bundled in a thick coat, a cane tapping softly against the wet sidewalk. His heart jumped. Was this trouble? But the man didn't stop. He just passed by, then paused, turned slightly, and looked back. Their eyes met for a second. The man didn't say anything, just nodded once like he understood something no one else did and kept walking. That small gesture, just a look, just a nod, made his throat tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He hadn't cried since the funeral, not once. But now, sitting alone in the freezing dark, he felt tears well up, hot against his cold cheeks. He wiped them quickly, angry at himself for being weak. Weakness got you noticed, and being noticed was dangerous. Still, as the night wore on and the temperature dropped further, he found himself thinking about that nod. It wasn't pity. It was something else, recognition maybe. Like the man had seen someone like him before, or maybe even been him once. By dawn, the sleet had turned to a light snow. He stood up stiffly, joints cracking, and slung his duffel over his shoulder. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. He had a routine now. Walk to the community center before it opened. Wait in line for a free breakfast if they had any left. then find a quiet corner to read or do math problems from an old textbook he'd salvaged from a dumpster behind the high school. Education felt like the only thing no one could take from him. As he passed a small auto repair shop on his way downtown, he noticed the garage door was open just a crack. Warm light spilled out along with the smell of oil and metal. He slowed for a second, drawn by the heat, but kept walking. He didn't belong there. People like him didn't belong anywhere with warmth and light and the sound of someone whistling while they worked. But fate, it turned out, had other plans. And sometimes the coldest nights lead to the most unexpected doors opening, even if you don't see them at first. Rain had a way of making everything feel heavier. Not just clothes, but thoughts too. That night it poured without mercy, turning sidewalks into shallow rivers and alleys into cold traps. He'd been walking for hours trying to find a dry spot, but every overhang was already claimed or too exposed. His shoes squelched with every step, his socks soaked through, and his duffel bag, once a lifeline, now dragged like an anchor. He ducked behind a low brick building with a faded sign that read, "Gus's Auto Repair," more out of instinct than hope. The back door was closed, but a vent near the ground hummed with warmth, leaking a thin stream of dry air into the wet night. He crouched beside it, peeling off his socks to wring them out. His fingers were stiff, his toes numb. He didn't notice the figure in the doorway until a voice cut through the drumming rain. "You planning to camp back here, or you just lost?" The voice was rough like gravel under tires, but not unkind. He looked up fast, heart pounding, ready to bolt. An older man stood there, leaning on a cane, wearing a grease-streaked flannel shirt and boots that had seen decades of oil stains. His face was lined with years, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. "Not suspicious, I'm not stealing anything," he said quickly, voice cracking from cold and disuse. "Didn't say you were," the man replied, stepping aside just enough to let the light from inside spill onto the wet concrete. "But you're gonna catch your death out here. Either come in or move on. I ain't running a hotel, but I ain't heartless either." He hesitated. Trust had burned him before, people offering help only to ask for something worse in return. But the warmth from that doorway felt like a promise, and he was so tired of being cold. He stepped inside. The shop smelled like metal, oil, and something faintly sweet, maybe old coffee. Tools hung neatly on pegboards. A workbench was cluttered but organized, like someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. In the corner, a space heater hummed, casting a soft orange glow. The man tossed him a dry towel without a word. Then, from a dented lunchbox on a shelf, he pulled out a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Eat," he said. "You look like you haven't in a week." He took it, hands shaking, and devoured it in 3 bites. It tasted like the best thing he'd ever eaten. The man watched him, arms crossed. "How old are you?" 16. "Where's your folks?" "Gone." That was enough. The man didn't press. He just nodded like he'd heard that story before and believed it. Over the next few nights he returned. Not because he was invited, but because the man never turned him away. He'd sit quietly in the corner, staying out of the way while the old man tinkered with engines, cursed at stubborn bolts, or listened to baseball games on a crackling radio. He never asked for anything. Just presence. And slowly the man started leaving the back door unlocked. One morning he showed up before sunrise with a broom he'd found leaning against a dumpster. Without saying a word, he started sweeping the garage floor. Chips of metal, oil spots, dust from tires. The man watched from his stool, sipping black coffee. When he finished, the man grunted. "Floor looks better than it has in years." Then he pointed to a shelf. "Rags are there. Wipe down the tool cabinet." That became the routine. Sweep, wipe, organize spare parts. Empty the trash. No pay, no promises, just work in exchange for a dry place to sit and sometimes a meal. The man never called it a job. He just said things like, "Hand me that socket wrench," or "You see that leak? That's a cracked hose, cheap fix, but people panic like it's the end of the world." He listened, watched, learned. He noticed how the man never rushed, even when customers were impatient. How he'd tap an engine block with his knuckles and know if something was off. How he'd talk to cars like they were old friends. "Come on, sweetheart, don't give me trouble today." It wasn't magic. It was attention, care, something he hadn't realized machines could receive. One afternoon, while sorting bolts into labeled jars, he asked, "How'd you learn all this?" The man paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "Same way you're learning now. By watching. By messing up. By caring enough to try again." He looked at him then, really looked. "You got good hands, steady. Most kids your age can't hold a wrench without dropping it. It was the first real compliment he'd heard in years. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and went back to sorting. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. But inside the garage, time moved differently. There was rhythm. Oil changes on Tuesdays, diagnostics on Thursdays, the weekend reserved for bigger jobs. He started helping with simple tasks, holding lights, fetching parts, even checking tire pressure. The man never praised him outright, but sometimes, when he did something right, the old man's shoulders would relax just a little, like a silent good job. One night, after a long day fixing a transmission, the man handed him a key. "There's a cot in the back room. Use it if you want. Just don't snore." He couldn't believe it. A real bed. 4 walls. A door that locked. He lay there that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the city and the occasional clink of tools settling in their places. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was hiding. He felt like he belonged, just a little. He started showing up earlier, staying later. He read repair manuals during lunch, practiced identifying parts blindfolded just to test himself, and once stayed up all night helping rebuild a carburetor for a classic car. The man refused to let go to a junkyard. "She's got soul," the man had said. "Just needs someone who listens." He began to understand that this place wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about giving things and people a second chance. One rainy evening, much like the first night, the man sat him down with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, made with real milk, not powder. "You're smart," he said, stirring his drink slowly. "Smarter than most folks who walk through that door. You could do more than this." "I don't want to leave," he blurted out, panic rising. The man chuckled. "Who said anything about leaving? I'm saying you should build something. Learn everything. Get your GED, go to trade school. This," he gestured around the garage, "isn't the end. It's the start." He hadn't let himself dream that far ahead. Survival had been the only goal. But now, for the first time, he let himself imagine a future where he wasn't just scraping by, where he could fix things, help people, maybe even own a place like this someday. The man didn't say much after that, just handed him a worn-out socket wrench the next morning and said, "Today you're changing the oil on the blue pickup." "I'll watch," and so he did. Hands steady, mind focused. Heart quieter than it had been in years. Outside the world was still cold. But inside that garage, something warm was growing. Not just from the heater, but from the quiet understanding between 2 people who'd both known what it meant to be alone. And sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. One open door, one dry towel, one person who sees you not as a problem, but as a possibility. By the time he turned 18, his hands were no longer soft. They were calloused, nicked with small scars from slipped wrenches and hot metal, permanently stained with a faint layer of grease that never quite washed out. But he didn't mind. Those hands had built something. First trust, then skill, and now, slowly, a future. The garage had become more than a workplace. It was home. He slept in the back room most nights, though he'd started spending weekends at a shared apartment with 2 other guys from the trade program, former foster kids like him, trying to stitch together lives from scraps of opportunity. But he always came back to the garage. It was where he felt most himself. He'd gotten his GED after months of late-night studying under the shop's fluorescent lights, textbooks propped open next to engine diagrams. The old man, Gus, though he rarely used his name, never made a big deal of it. Just slid a 20 across the workbench the day he passed and said, "Buy yourself a decent meal. You earned it." But the pride in his eyes was louder than any speech. Now he was enrolled in night classes at the community college's automotive tech program. During the day, he worked full-time at the shop, handling everything from brake jobs to electrical diagnostics. Customers started asking for him by name. "That quiet kid who actually listens," one woman said. "Fix my van in half the time," the dealership quoted. He didn't see himself as special. He just paid attention. Noticed how a hesitation in the engine could mean a clogged fuel injector, or how a faint burning smell might be a failing alternator, not just old age, like some mechanics like to say. He treated every car like it mattered because to the person driving it, it did. That old sedan might be someone's only way to get to work. That minivan might carry 3 kids to school every morning. He fixed more than metal. He kept lives moving. One spring morning, Gus tossed him the keys to a rust-speckled sedan parked out back. It had mismatched hubcaps, a cracked windshield, and a muffler that sounded like a dying goose. But it ran. "You've been walking 2 miles to class in the rain," Gus said, not looking up from the engine he was rebuilding. "This ain't pretty, but it'll get you there dry." He stared at the keys like they were made of gold. "I can't take this." "You already did," Gus replied. "You've earned every bolt on that frame. Now go register it before someone steals it for scrap." That car became his pride. He fixed the muffler himself, patched the windshield with clear resin, even sewed a new seat cover from fabric he found at a thrift store. It wasn't fast or flashy, but it was his, and for the first time he had a place to sleep that wasn't borrowed or temporary. Some nights he'd park near the river, crack the windows, and just listen to the water while eating a sandwich from the gas station. No one knew he was there. No one judged him. It was peace. But peace didn't mean he stopped pushing. He took on extra shifts, saved every dollar, and started doing side jobs, fixing neighbors' lawnmowers, tuning up bikes for kids on the block. He never charged much, sometimes just enough to cover parts. Word spread. People trusted him because he didn't talk down to them or pad the bill. He'd show them the broken part, explain what it did, and let them decide if it was worth fixing. One afternoon, a single mom brought in her ancient hatchback, tears in her eyes. "If this doesn't run, I lose my job," she said quietly. "Daycare won't hold my spot if I'm late again." He stayed late that night, long after Gus had gone home. The starter motor was shot, the battery weak, and the timing belt frayed. Most shops would have told her to junk it, but he knew better. He called in a favor with a junkyard buddy, got a used starter for $20, rebuilt the battery terminals, and replaced the belt with one he'd been saving for emergencies. Total cost to her, $40 and a home-baked pie she insisted on bringing the next day. Gus found out and just shook his head. "You're gonna go broke being kind." "Maybe," he said, "but I'd rather be broke and sleep okay at night." Gus didn't argue. Just handed him a cold soda and said, "Next time, charge her $50. You're worth it." As the months passed, his confidence grew, not in a loud way, but in the quiet certainty of someone who knows what they can do. He started taking on complex jobs Gus used to handle alone. Full engine rebuilds, custom wiring for classic cars, even retrofitting older models with modern safety features. He read forums, watched tutorials, and once spent an entire weekend taking apart and reassembling a fuel injection system just to understand it better. He also began noticing kids like he used to be, hanging around the edges of the neighborhood, eyes down, shoulders hunched against the world. One afternoon, he saw a boy no older than 15 trying to siphon gas from a parked car. Instead of yelling, he walked over and said, "That's gonna get you arrested, but if you're hungry, I've got leftover pizza in the shop." The boy looked stunned, then suspicious, but hunger won. He followed. Now that same kid swept the garage floor 3 afternoons a week, learning how to check oil and rotate tires. He wasn't paid much, but he got meals, a warm place to sit, and someone who asked how his day was. Not what he'd done wrong. Gus watched it all with quiet approval. "You're building something bigger than a garage," he said one evening as they closed up. "I just don't want anyone to feel as alone as I did," he replied. "You won't," Gus said. "Not if you keep going like this." Graduation from the tech program came in a small ceremony held in the college gym. Only a handful of people attended, mostly instructors and a few students' families. Gus was there, sitting in the back in his best flannel shirt, no cane, standing straighter than usual. When they called his name, he walked across the stage, diploma in hand, and caught Gus giving him a rare, full smile. That night, they celebrated with burgers from the diner down the street, the same one his grandmother used to work at. They sat in the same booth she'd cleaned for 20 years. He didn't say much, just traced the chipped edge of the table with his thumb and felt her presence, like she was finally seeing what he'd become. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Debt, competition, the constant pressure to prove himself in a world that often dismissed people with his past. But for the first time, he wasn't running from something. He was building towards something, and that made all the difference. The garage wasn't fancy. It sat on a quiet stretch of road lined with tire shops, laundromats, and a boarded-up diner that used to serve the best pie in town. But what it lacked in polish, it made up for in honesty. Word had spread that if you brought your car here, you wouldn't get upsold, talked down to, or left guessing what was wrong. You'd get a clear explanation, a fair price, and a mechanic who actually cared whether your headlights worked in the rain. He'd opened it 2 years after finishing trade school, renting a small bay from a retiring shop owner who'd heard about his reputation. At first it was just him, a folding chair and a toolbox he'd saved for months to afford, but slowly customers came back. Then they brought friends. Then strangers started showing up, referred by someone who'd once been stranded and left with a working car and a little more hope than they arrived with. He hired his first employee, a quiet teenager who'd aged out of foster care and had nowhere to go, after catching him sleeping in the alley behind the shop. Instead of calling the cops, he offered him a broom and a sandwich. Now that kid handled oil changes and tire rotations like a pro, and had just enrolled in night classes himself. Business wasn't booming, but it was steady, enough to pay rent, cover parts, and put a little away each month. He lived simply, still drove the old sedan, still patched his work shirts, still ate most meals at the counter of the 24-hour diner down the street. Luxury wasn't something he thought about. Survival had shaped him too deeply for that. Then came the winter day that changed everything. It was snowing lightly, the kind of quiet snow that muffles the world. He was under a lifted pickup replacing brake lines when he heard the unmistakable sputter of an engine dying right outside. He slid out, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped into the cold. A sleek foreign-made sedan, low, dark, and clearly worth more than his entire shop, was stalled in the middle of the lane. Steam curled from the hood. Behind the wheel sat a man in a tailored coat, looking more annoyed than alarmed. He stepped out, phone already to his ear, speaking in a language that sounded smooth and sharp, like polished stone. When he saw the garage sign, he hesitated, then walked over. "Do you work on European models?" he asked in accented English. "Depends on the problem," he replied. "But I can take a look." The man sighed, clearly skeptical, but nodded. It just cut out. No warning. He popped the hood, peered inside, and within minutes spotted the issue. A loose fuel line connection, probably jostled loose by the cold. A 10-minute fix, if that. He tightened it, checked the system, and started the engine. It purred to life instantly. The man stared, surprised. "Just like that?" "Sometimes it's not the expensive things that break," he said, closing the hood. "Just the simple ones." He didn't charge him. Didn't even ask for payment. "You're not from around here," he said. "Consider it a welcome gift." The man studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat. "Not for a wallet, but for a business card." "My name is Henrik," he said. "I'm in town for a few weeks. If you ever need anything, or if you're interested in something bigger, call me." He took the card but didn't think much of it. Rich people said things like that out of politeness, not promise. But 3 weeks later, Henrik walked into the garage again, this time without a broken car. He wore jeans and a sweater, looking less like a businessman and more like someone who'd come to talk. "I couldn't stop thinking about this place," he said, glancing around at the organized chaos of tools, half-built engines, and hand-scrawled notes taped to walls. "You've got something rare here. Skill, yes, but also soul." He didn't understand where this was going. Henrik explained that he invested in niche automotive ventures specializing in restoring and customizing high-end classic cars for collectors who valued craftsmanship over flash. "Most shops today just replace parts," he said. "You understand how things work. That's disappearing." Then came the offer. Henrik would fund a new division, high-end restoration, right here in this very garage. He'd handle the capital, the client network, the marketing. All he'd need to do is lead it, design, build, and bring old machines back to life with a modern touch. He laughed at first. "You want to turn this place into a luxury shop? Look around. We fix minivans and delivery trucks. And you do it better than most," Henrik said calmly. "That's exactly why I'm asking. I don't want perfection. I want character. And you've got it." For days he wrestled with the idea. It felt like stepping into a world he didn't belong in. Polished floors, white-glove clients, cars that cost more than houses. But then he thought about Gus, who'd taught him that every machine had a story. Even the fanciest car was just metal, oil, and intention. And maybe he could prove that someone from the streets could handle the rarest engines with the same care he gave to a single mom's hatchback. He said yes. The transformation wasn't overnight. They expanded the bay, added climate control for delicate paintwork, and brought in specialized tools. But he insisted on keeping the back room, the one with the cot and the coffee-stained manuals exactly as it was. "That's where I learned," he told Henrik. "I'm not erasing that." His first project was a 1967 Italian sports car, abandoned in a barn for 30 years. Crusted, seized, covered in dust and bird droppings. Most would have scrapped it. He saw potential. For weeks he worked alone late into the night, coaxing the engine back to life bolt by bolt. He rebuilt the carburetor from memory, rewired the entire electrical system by hand, and even sourced period-correct leather for the seats. When it finally roared to life, a deep, throaty growl that echoed down the street, Henrik stood in the doorway, silent, eyes wide. "You didn't just fix it," he said. "You gave it a second life." Word spread fast in that world. A collector in Monaco heard about the restoration, then another in Tokyo. Soon people were flying in just to see what the kid from the old repair shop could do with a forgotten classic. He never bragged, never raised his rates just because he could. He charged fairly, delivered early, and always explained every detail to the owner like they were family. But the real joy wasn't in the cars. It was in the team he built. He hired more kids, some from shelters, some from juvenile records, all with something to prove. He taught them not just how to weld or tune, but how to look someone in the eye, how to take pride in honest work, how to believe they were more than their past. One evening, as he wiped down a freshly polished hood, Henrik asked, "Do you ever miss the old days?" He thought about it. Not the cold, not the hunger. "But I miss how clear things were. You either fixed it, or you didn't. No politics, no pretending." Henrik nodded. "Maybe that's why you're succeeding. You never forgot what matters." Outside, snow began to fall again. Soft, quiet, the same kind that had brought them together. But this time he wasn't under a bus shelter. He was standing in a garage he'd built from nothing, surrounded by people who believed in him, working on a dream he never knew he was allowed to have, and somewhere, deep in the hum of an engine coming back to life, he could almost hear his grandmother whispering, "I knew you would." The morning air was crisp, the kind that carries the promise of change without making a sound. 5 cars lined the narrow street, sleek, custom-built, each one a masterpiece of engineering and artistry. Chrome gleamed under the pale sun, tires flawless, paint so deep it looked like liquid midnight or molten copper, depending on the angle. Neighbors slowed their walks. Kids pressed against chain-link fences, eyes wide, whispering like they'd stumbled onto a movie set. But this wasn't Hollywood. This was home. Just a few doors down from where those cars now idled, a bus shelter still stood, the same one where, years ago, a shivering teenager had curled into himself, trying to disappear into the cold. Back then, the only thing parked nearby was despair. Now luxury vehicles filled the lane not for show, but because their owners had driven them here on purpose, just to see what came out of this unassuming garage on the corner. Inside, he wasn't polishing hoods or signing contracts. He was kneeling beside a beat-up sedan with dented doors and mismatched hubcaps, showing a boy how to check the oil. The kid couldn't have been older than 16, with eyes that darted too quickly and hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from hunger. He'd shown up 3 days ago sleeping behind the dumpster, too proud to ask for help but too tired to keep hiding. "See this dipstick?" he said, pulling it out slowly. "Wipe it clean, put it back in, then pull it out again. The oil should be amber, not black, not milky. If it's low, you add a little at a time. Never guess." The boy nodded, watching closely, then tried it himself. His hands were clumsy at first, but determined. When he got it right, a flicker of something, relief, maybe pride, crossed his face. From the doorway, Gus watched, leaning on his cane like always, though he didn't really need it anymore. He'd slowed down over the years, letting the younger hands take the heavy lifts, but he still came by every morning for coffee and to keep an eye on things, as he put it. Truth was, he came to see what this place had become, not just a garage, but a lifeline. The program had started small, just a cot in the back room, a hot meal, and a chance to learn. But it grew. Now they partnered with local outreach centers, offering housing support, GED tutoring, and real apprenticeships. Every kid who walked through the door got the same thing he'd once been given: a dry place, a fair chance, and someone who believed they could do more than survive. He never called it charity. He called it responsibility. One of the luxury cars outside belonged to Henrik, who'd flown in just to attend the opening of their new training wing, a renovated warehouse down the block, equipped with classrooms, tool stations, and even a small kitchen where volunteers cooked meals. But Henrik wasn't here for the ribbon cutting. He was here because he'd heard about the boy, sleeping behind the dumpster, and wanted to make sure he had a winter coat. Another car belonged to a collector from Dubai who'd flown in not to pick up his restored classic, though that was waiting, but to donate a fleet of old project cars for the trainees to practice on. If you can bring life back to metal, he'd said, you can bring life back to people. But the real magic wasn't in the donations or the headlines. It was in the quiet moments. The teenager who'd just passed his certification exam, the former runaway now teaching brake repair to newcomers, the single mom who'd once cried over a broken starter now managing the front desk. He stood up, brushing grease off his jeans, and walked to the window. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows. He looked down the street at the bus shelter now empty, at the snow-dusted sidewalk where he'd once counted his steps to stay awake, at the very spot where cold had nearly won. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt grateful and responsible. Later that afternoon, after the visitors left and the street quieted, he found the boy from the dumpster sitting alone on a tire stack, staring at his hands like they were foreign objects. "You okay?" he asked, handing him a thermos of hot chocolate. The boy nodded, then hesitated. I never thought anyone would teach me something real. Everyone else said I'd end up in jail or worse." He sat beside him. "People say a lot of things when they don't know your story. But your story isn't written yet. You get to write it, one wrench turn at a time." The boy smiled faintly. It was the first real one he'd seen. As dusk settled, he locked up the garage and walked to his car, the same old sedan, now with a rebuilt engine and a fresh coat of wax, but still humble, still his. He didn't need the luxury models parked outside to feel successful. Success wasn't in the cars. It was in the hands that fixed them, in the lives that got a second chance because someone once opened a door instead of closing it. On the drive home, he passed the diner where his grandmother used to work. The sign was new, but the booth in the corner was still there. He pulled over, went inside, and ordered a slice of apple pie, her favorite. He ate it slowly, watching the street through the window. Outside, the world kept turning. But somewhere in garages and alleys and shelters, kids were still sleeping in the cold, still wondering if anyone saw them. He finished his pie, left a generous tip, and walked out. Tomorrow, he'd be back at the garage before sunrise. There'd be engines to fix, lessons to teach, and maybe, just maybe, another kid waiting in the shadows hoping someone would notice. And he would. Because he never forgot what it felt like to be invisible, so he made sure every single day to look.